Agatha Raisin and mystery behind Deadly Daffodils. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to the Detective Notebook. Tonight we once again slip into the charming but never peaceful village of Carsely, tucked deep in the rolling Cotswolds. A place where the kettle is always warm, the gossip travels fast, and even a simple cream tea can spell disaster. Before we begin, feel free to tap the like button and subscribe, only if this kind of cozy chaos is your cup of tea. It truly helps the channel grow and keeps these mysteries coming your way. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing how far our little mystery community reaches. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and grab a cup of tea, because tonight, again, we are going to step into Agatha's world.
Chapter 1. Breakfast with Judgment. Agatha Raisin woke precisely at 7, not because she needed to, but because discipline, like good cheekbones, had to be maintained. She lay still for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of spring outside and the far less faint sound of Boswell scratching pointedly at the bedroom door. Hodge joined in with a mournful yowl that suggested starvation had been ongoing for several minutes, possibly hours. Agatha sighed, swung her legs out of bed, and caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her hair behaved, her face looked acceptable, and that was as much optimism as she allowed herself before breakfast. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled reassuringly of coffee grounds and toast. Agatha measured the coffee with care, strong enough to frighten the spoon, and dropped bread into the toaster while pretending for her own peace of mind that butter was an optional extravagance. Hodge and Boswell sat side by side, tails neatly wrapped, eyes narrowed with synchronized disapproval. They watched her outfit choice with the air of two elderly aunts assessing a questionable hemline. "I am not dressing for you," Agatha informed them sharply, smoothing her blouse. Boswell flicked an ear. Hodge stared at her shoes as if they personally offended him. She filled their bowls, enduring the familiar sensation of being judged inadequate, and carried her coffee to the window. Carsely lay bathed in pale morning light, cottages glowing softly, gardens erupting in cheerful disorder. Daffodils lined the lane in militant rows, yellow heads bobbing smugly. The spring festival banners had gone up overnight, and someone, probably Darcy Somerville, had arranged them with unnecessary enthusiasm. Darcy! Agatha's jaw tightened. Even from this distance she could imagine her rival's satisfied smile, the kind that came from winning Best Daffodil Display 5 years running and making sure everyone knew it. Darcy had a way of standing beside her flowers as though she'd personally invented yellow. Agatha took a defiant sip of coffee and told herself she didn't care. She cared just enough to care angrily. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Witherspoon from 2 cottages down leaned in cheerfully, armed with a basket and unsolicited opinions. "Morning, Agatha. Aren't the daffodils looking marvelous this year, though I did hear someone say the competition might turn deadly, poisoning the soil or something equally dramatic." Agatha laughed politely, because that was what one did with nonsense. "People will say anything for attention," she replied, though the word poisoning lingered unpleasantly. Mrs. Witherspoon chattered on about judges and bake sales before departing, leaving behind the faint smell of lavender and gossip. Agatha returned to the window. Something tugged at her attention. Among the rows of cheerful blooms, one patch looked wrong. The petals were too glossy, almost waxy, as if polished. They caught the light oddly, reflecting instead of glowing. Agatha frowned, leaning closer. Gardening was not her passion, but even she knew flowers weren't meant to look artificial. Boswell jumped onto the sill, following her gaze. He sniffed, sneezed, and glared at the daffodils with theatrical suspicion. "Don't start," Agatha muttered, though a small chill crept up her spine. For a ridiculous moment she had the sensation of being watched, as though the village itself had paused to observe her reaction. She straightened, annoyed with herself. Carsely was peaceful, Spring was cheerful. Daffodils were harmless. Still, she grabbed her handbag with more force than necessary and checked her reflection once more. Vanity intact, curiosity piqued, irritation fully loaded, Agatha Raisin stepped out into the morning, carrying the faint, unwelcome thought that something in Carsely had gone quietly wrong.
The village green had been transformed into a shrine to optimism. Bunting fluttered between the trees, trestle tables groaned under the weight of cakes that would later collapse dramatically, and daffodils, thousands of them, stood to attention in pots, tubs, and carefully aligned borders. The air smelled of cut grass, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of lemon drizzle. Somewhere, a radio played an overly cheerful tune that made Agatha want to trip over the extension cord. At the center of it all stood Darcy Somerville. Darcy wore yellow, not a modest accent, but a full-bodied look-at-me yellow, tailored to flatter and chosen to dominate. She hovered beside her daffodil display with proprietary pride, hands clasped lightly as if in prayer to herself. The flowers were immaculate, symmetrical, and infuriatingly healthy. Agatha slowed her steps, resisting the urge to inspect them with a magnifying glass and a warrant. "Agatha," Darcy said smoothly, spotting her at once, "do come and admire them properly. Morning light really brings out their superiority." Agatha smiled thinly. "I'd hate to be overwhelmed before 11s," she replied, leaning in just enough to look interested without conceding defeat. Up close, the flowers were flawless. Too flawless, she thought, remembering the waxy patch she'd seen earlier. Darcy noticed her gaze and shifted subtly, as though shielding children from a draft. Other women clustered nearby, murmuring compliments that sounded suspiciously like grievances. Mrs. Peel sniffed and said the yellow was a bit aggressive. Mrs. Turner remarked that symmetry could be boring. No one sounded convinced, least of all themselves. Jealousy hung in the air like perfume, expensive, unmistakable, and slightly suffocating. Agatha folded her arms, aware of Darcy's quick glance at her shoes, her hair, her posture. Darcy always did that, assessed, catalogued, compared. It was exhausting, but Agatha refused to lose. She leaned in and said pleasantly, "You must be exhausted, Darcy. Keeping perfection alive looks like hard work." Darcy laughed, a tinkling sound with no warmth. "Some of us enjoy standards." Before Agatha could respond with something regrettable, a small commotion rippled through the crowd. A thin man with earnest eyes and soil-stained cuffs hurried toward the display, notebook clutched like a lifeline. Clive Morton, head judge, amateur botanist, and a man who took flowers far more seriously than people. "Careful, careful," Clive muttered, crouching to peer at the soil. He poked gently, sniffed, and frowned. Darcy stiffened. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong," he said quickly, too quickly. "Just unusual, very vigorous growth, almost unnaturally so." He straightened, brushing dirt from his knees, and glanced around as if the daffodils might overhear him. "We do have rules, after all, about soil treatments, imported bulbs. One must be fair." Agatha's ears pricked. "Rules are very fashionable this year," she remarked lightly. Clive jumped, startled. "Oh, Mrs. Raisin. Yes, well, rules keep competitions honest." He smiled nervously, eyes darting back to Darcy's flowers. "My flowers are entirely within regulations, Clive. You've seen my paperwork." Yes, of course," Clive said, backing away. "Just routine checks." He moved on, fussing over another display with exaggerated calm. Agatha watched him go, unease settling beneath her irritation. Clive looked flustered, not officious. Afraid, perhaps. She glanced again at Darcy's immaculate blooms and felt that same prickle of unease she'd dismissed earlier. The radio crackled. Someone called for volunteers, and the green buzzed with activity.
Festival preparations intensified, laughter, clinking cups, rustling petals, but Agatha stood still for a moment, suspicion blooming quietly. If rules had been broken, someone stood to lose. And in Carsely, losing rarely went unnoticed.
Chapter 2. A Bloom Turns Black. Agatha arrived at the vicarage promptly at 10, as one does when a village tea has been announced. The morning sun spilled through leaded windows, catching the dust motes in lazy golden rays. Mrs. Bloxby, resplendent in a floral apron and a determination to correct everyone's moral compass, greeted her warmly. "Agatha, my dear, just in time for scones." The smell of baking drifted through the hallway, warm, buttery, and slightly overspiced with nutmeg. Agatha's stomach approved immediately. Hodge and Boswell, of course, were absent. They would have judged this venue severely had they been present, and Agatha appreciated the reprieve. She accepted her cup of Earl Grey with a carefully neutral expression, sitting on a chair that squeaked in protest under her weight. Mrs. Bloxby placed a plate of golden scones before her, and the first bite was perfection, crisp edges yielding to tender, buttery interiors. "So," Mrs. Bloxby began, wielding a spoon like a sermon, "Darcy Somerville's victory is practically assured, isn't it? 5 years running is no accident, you know. And, well, honesty is a virtue, but some might say ambition colors the soul. That is a moral lesson, you see, Agatha." Agatha chewed delicately, trying to hide the grimace that followed the moral lecture. "Yes, Mrs. Bloxby, ambition can indeed be colorful." A chorus of nods and murmurs followed, mostly from villagers pretending to care while sneaking glances at each other's teacups and tiny scones. The conversation looped lazily around Darcy's dominance, the previous year's judging scandal, and the merits of lemon curd versus clotted cream. Agatha had just decided to let the gossip swirl over her like a pleasant cloud when a piercing scream cleaved the warm air. The teacups rattled, spoons clanged, and Mrs. Bloxby's moralistic smile froze mid-sentence. Agatha felt her heart give a small leap. She left her scone untouched and pushed the door open. Beyond the hedges, near the daffodil displays, lay Clive Morton. He was sprawled unceremoniously, one arm splayed across a tipped-over teacup, his lips tinged with a faint, unnatural blue. The surrounding daffodils seemed untouched, bright and immaculate, as if mocking the tragedy. Agatha's first thought, oddly practical, was that someone had spilled tea in a spectacularly careless manner. Her second was darker. Could it have been poison? A small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Turner clutched her hat in a faint swoon. Darcy Somerville's face had gone white, and she was patting her gloves as if they might somehow remedy the situation. Agatha stepped closer, noting the shock in the villagers' eyes and the absurd contrast of bright, cheerful flowers beside a motionless man. "Call the police," someone whispered, though no one moved fast enough to seem efficient. Agatha took stock. The tea, the pristine flowers, Clive alone in a patch of daffodils. Was this an accident or deliberate? Who had last seen him, and why? As the distant wail of sirens began, the village's serenity fractured. The smell of damp soil mixed with tea and faint perfume, the colors of spring no longer seemed comforting, but accusatory. Agatha knelt briefly beside Clive, careful not to touch more than necessary, noting the orderly arrangement of the nearest blooms. There was a subtle perfection that did not belong to chance. She straightened, brushing off her skirt and adjusting her scarf, suddenly aware of the weight of curiosity pressing on her chest. Carsley's calm, ordered morning had cracked. Somewhere among the daffodils, someone held a secret, and Agatha Raisin intended to find it. As she took her first step back towards the hedges, the daffodils swayed lightly in the breeze, almost as if they were pointing, silently accusing, and Agatha felt the tiniest thrill of anticipation. Something about this scene promised trouble, and she, naturally, could not resist.
By mid-morning, the village green resembled a scene from a theater production gone slightly awry. Police tape fluttered between posts, officers walked briskly, and the crowd of curious villagers murmured incessantly. The official verdict, Clive Morton's death, was suspicious. The statement itself was delivered in that calm, clipped tone that suggested competence, though Agatha suspected the officers were as confused as everyone else. Darcy Somerville lay on a folding chair nearby, handkerchief pressed dramatically to her forehead. I never imagined such a thing," she wailed. Her yellow hat had slipped at a rakish angle, and Agatha, in spite of herself, suppressed a smile. The faintest sense of pity nudged her. Darcy's fainting style was as meticulously rehearsed as her daffodils, but it was quickly replaced by irritation. Fainting did nothing to solve the problem, and Clive lay dead for very real reasons. Villagers clustered in anxious groups, exchanging whispers that were part speculation, part scandal, and part delight. Agatha noted the patterns in their conversations: who avoided eye contact, who lingered a little too long near the flowers, who spoke in clipped sentences. She crouched subtly, examining the ground near Clive's collapse. Oddities leapt out immediately. The soil closest to him had been disturbed, turned as though someone had been digging or planting recently. Worse, Clive's notebook, normally clutched obsessively in his hand, was missing. Her gaze swept the daffodils, perfect, suspiciously vibrant, and then returned to Darcy. The woman's eyes were wet, voice quivering. Agatha filed the display under possible distraction. She had been hoping for a smooth day of gentle village intrigue, not a blatant murder and theatrics worthy of a stage. Professional irritation replaced her earlier jealousy. Darcy's perfection suddenly seemed trivial against such incompetence or stupidity or outright recklessness. Someone had attempted murder in the village's most public space, and in true Carsely fashion, it was being treated like a minor scandal. Eventually, Agatha returned home, where the familiar smell of her kitchen, strong coffee, toast crumbs, and the faint musk of 2 cats provided a comforting counterpoint. Hodge and Boswell greeted her with the usual disdain, tails twitching, demanding breakfast a second time, or perhaps dinner in anticipation. "Yes, yes, I see you're judging me," Agatha muttered as she poured kibble into their bowls. The cats ate with deliberate slowness, eyes fixed on her as if to say, "How could you let this happen?" She poured herself a cup of tea and leaned against the counter, considering the day's events. Clive's notebook was missing. Soil had been disturbed. Darcy had fainted in a fashion that even her cats raised an eyebrow. And all the while the daffodils swayed outside, sunny and oblivious. Agatha's thoughts coalesced. Something about this scene was fundamentally wrong, and the right questions had not yet been asked. By the time Hodge had finished his 3rd helping and Boswell had staged a silent protest on the windowsill, Agatha had resolved to act. She could no longer ignore the signs, no matter how petty the village rivalries, or how inconvenient it was for her schedule. Murder, after all, was nothing if not persistent, and in Carsely, curiosity was an essential survival tool. Agatha sighed, stirring her tea and watching the steam curl lazily into the kitchen light. She would ask questions. Carefully, subtly, politely, but with all the determination that came from having endured Darcy Somerville's triumphs and Hodge's judgmental glare. One thing was certain. This was no ordinary spring festival, and someone had made a grave mistake. Agatha Raisin would find out who, and she would not be gentle about it.
Chapter 3. Petals, Pettiness, and People with Alibis. Agatha set out from her cottage with a sense of grim purpose, crossing the dew-dampened lanes of Carsely. The sun glinted off the thatched roofs, birds twittered in sympathetic accompaniment to her irritation, and the scent of fresh soil and spring blossoms clung to the air. Today, she would interview the female competitors, those who had spent months fussing over petals, soil, and the exact angle of their daffodil displays. Her first stop was Mrs. Peel's cottage, a quaint structure with peeling paint and the faintly overpowering aroma of lavender and stale biscuits. Mrs. Peel answered the door wearing a hat that might have been described politely as ambitious. "Agatha, come in, come in."
She ushered her into a parlor stuffed with floral prints, a sofa that sagged dangerously, an assortment of teacups that seemed to judge anyone who dared touch them. Over the faintly metallic tang of early tea, Agatha learned of subtle resentments. Mrs. Peel admitted, with a faint blush and a glance at her own manicured nails, that she had heard rumors of tampering, fertilizer misapplied, bulbs switched, soil adjusted. She insisted she had no part in it, that it was only gossip. Agatha's lips twitched in a smile. Gossip was a specialty in Carsely, and nobody did it better than Mrs. Peel. Next was Mrs. Turner, who greeted her with a smile sharper than a pruning knife. "Darcy's flowers are, of course, flawless," she said, offering Agatha a cup of tea with an elegance that suggested hidden teeth, "though I confess Clive's critiques last year were trying. Some might say discourteous. I, for one, hope he appreciates the effort we put in. But one mustn't hold grudges, yes?" Agatha sipped politely, noting the bitterness in the tea that mirrored the underlying tension. She filed it away. Someone was resentful, but not about murder, at least not yet. She made a mental note. Jealousy was everywhere, and motives could hide behind the smallest of petals. Finally, she visited Darcy Somerville herself. The greenhouse smelled of damp earth and faintly overpowering floral sprays. Darcy hovered protectively over her daffodils, hands lightly brushing leaves, as though anyone who touched them without permission might contract a dreadful disease. "Agatha," Darcy said, voice bright but sharp, "I trust your morning has been eventful." Agatha chose her words with care. "As ever, I find inspiration in your dedication." She watched Darcy's sharp smile twitch slightly, like a cat hiding its claws. The greenhouse was pristine, almost sterile, and Darcy's possessiveness over it was palpable. Agatha had the sense that Darcy was hiding something, but whether it was dangerous or merely proprietary remained unclear. Throughout the morning, each visit offered tiny, delicious clues, subtle inconsistencies in stories, glances too quick, words chosen too carefully. Agatha noted it all. Jealousy hung thickly, blending with nervous pride and competitive fervor, creating a heady atmosphere in which even minor inconveniences felt like transgressions. Yet beneath the petty rivalries, she sensed no immediate threat of murder, only human folly, ambition, and vanity. By the time she returned to the village green, her thoughts were sharpened and her curiosity ignited. The women had revealed their secrets and rivalries without spilling a drop of truly damning information. Still, one truth lingered at the edges of her mind. Someone was lying, but not about murder, and that, she knew, was just the kind of challenge she relished. With a faint exhale, Agatha turned her attention toward the men, who, she reflected wily, were never any less exasperating. If the women were riddled with rivalry, the men were riddled with excuses, and she intended to interrogate them both thoroughly.
The village green smelled of damp soil, spent blooms, and the faint tang of overbrewed tea as Agatha approached the trio of men who had been hovering near the perimeter of the daffodil displays. Their attire ranged from sensible tweed jackets caked with mud to floristry aprons smeared with what could only be described as ambitious pollen. She took a deep breath, savoring the mixture of earthiness and faint cologne, comforting in a grim sort of way. First came Mr. Cartwright, the groundskeeper, a man who treated his spade like a musical instrument and wore dirt as though it were an honor badge. "Good morning, Mrs. Raisin," he said, tipping his hat and grinning with teeth that suggested a lifetime of enjoying bad puns. "I was only rearranging the soil near the tulips," he laughed, then grimaced. "And, well, maybe some daffodils, too. But all innocent, I swear, honest." "Rearranging soil at 9 in the morning?" Agatha asked mildly, noting his gaze dart toward Darcy's greenhouse. "Was that necessary?" "Oh, it's my hobby. Keeps the knees young and the daffodils alert." He chuckled at his own joke, which fell flat.
Next, she spoke with Mr. Haversham, the floristry supplier. His hair was wild, his apron patched, and he seemed genuinely afraid she would look too closely at his shoes. "Mrs. Raisin, I only supply what's legal, I swear. Clive, he accused someone, but not me. Illegal bulbs," he said. "Can you imagine? I have a reputation." His eyes flicked nervously to Darcy's display, and Agatha noted the twitch of his fingers. "Illegal bulbs?" she repeated, tasting the word like bitter chocolate. It echoed ominously like an unpinned notice on her subconscious. Why would bulbs be illegal? And who had imported them? She stored the thought carefully, like a bookmark in a very complicated book. Finally, there was Mr. Fenwick, an amateur gardener with a limp from tripping over his own hedge last summer. He smirked, waving a hand to deflect suspicion. "I was inspecting my prize-winning roses, of course. Never touched Clive's area. Not that I'm above a little mischief, just the sort that leaves no evidence." He laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that implied he enjoyed causing confusion without committing crime. Agatha noted all three men had access, had motives ranging from pride to petty revenge, and provided flimsy alibis embroidered with humor that was more defensive than genuinely funny. None admitted wrongdoing, yet each hid something, carefully, subtly, instinctively. By the time she returned home, the late afternoon light spilled through her kitchen window, illuminating Hodge and Boswell waiting as usual. Boswell perched atop her notes, swishing his tail with deliberate authority, while Hodge settled on the windowsill, smirking at her through narrowed eyes. Agatha sighed, pouring tea for herself and muttering, "You lot are hardly helpful." The sense of puzzle pieces shifting under the weight of gossip, jealousy, and half-truths pressed on her mind. Illegal bulbs, disturbed soil, and missing notebooks created a web thicker than anyone imagined. Her casual rivalry with Darcy now felt irrelevant. The case was rooting itself deeper, entwining with motives, secrets, and pride in ways Carsely had never seen before. Agatha sipped her tea, letting the warmth spread through her fingers and chest, grounding her. She watched the cats settled in their judgmental perches and realized that the village's quaint, cozy surface hid something far more intricate. She would need patience, cunning, and a strong dose of stubbornness. One thing was certain, the daffodils were no longer merely ornamental. They were entangled with secrets that would not remain buried for long.
Chapter 4. Greenhouses and Green-Eyed Monsters. Agatha approached Darcy Somerville's greenhouse with the kind of caution normally reserved for heists in spy novels, or at least for raiding a neighbor's impeccable flower collection. The glass panes gleamed under the morning sun, reflecting rows of perfect yellow blooms, and the scent of moist earth and concentrated fertilizer drifted out, sharp and almost metallic. Agatha clutched the borrowed keys like they were instruments of justice. She eased the door open, half expecting a trap. Inside, the greenhouse was warm and humid, a small jungle of meticulously arranged pots. Daffodils of every conceivable variety crowded the benches, some imported, others hybridized, each tagged with neat labels. Except a few labels had been scratched off entirely. Agatha squinted, noting the glossy residue of ink and the faint impression of previous names. Why remove them? Her eyes swept over the benches, absorbing the subtle differences. Some bulbs looked unusually robust, almost as if nurtured with obsessive care. The soil smelled richer than usual, a faint tang that hinted at chemical fertilizers. Nothing immediately lethal, she noted, but the combination of exotic bulbs, strange feeding, and mysterious labels sent a tiny thrill of suspicion down her spine. Someone knew their horticulture too well. "Mrs. Raisin," a sharp voice said. Agatha jumped, nearly toppling a pot of miniature daffodils. Darcy Somerville stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like twin sharp knives. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Agatha straightened, trying to appear calm, though her heart thumped with the audacity of her intrusion. "I
thought I might take a closer look at the flowers, for comparative purposes," she said, hoping her tone suggested scholarly interest rather than creeping voyeurism. Darcy's expression softened into a thinly veiled glare. "Comparative? Really, Agatha, must you turn everything into a competition, even in my greenhouse?" She stepped inside, brushing a stray leaf from a pot. "These daffodils require careful tending. Not everyone has the finesse." Agatha resisted rolling her eyes. "Ah, finesse, yes. That explains the perfect blooms and the mysteriously missing labels." She forced a wry smile. "Curiosity is my crime, I'm afraid. I do enjoy knowing what makes a daffodil exceptional." Darcy's lips pressed into a tight line. "Exceptional care, that is all. And the fertilizer? Simply enriched. Nothing illegal." She studied Agatha, then added, "I would hope you understand the importance of discretion, Mrs. Raisin." "Oh, perfectly understood. I only want to ensure the competition is fair, nothing more." Her gaze drifted to the scratched labels again. "Fairness is difficult when the rules are ambiguous, isn't it?" Darcy's eyes flicked toward the exotic bulbs, then back to Agatha. There was a pause, a shared recognition of rivalry, intelligence, and the absurdity of their confrontation. Two women, poised with sharp words and sharper glances, surrounded by perfect blooming daffodils, both aware that their envy, pride, and curiosity were dancing dangerously close to confession. Finally, Darcy straightened and smoothed her gloves. "Very well, but do remember, Agatha, not everything should be inspected so eagerly." Her tone carried warning, amusement, and grudging respect all at once. Agatha offered a small, polite smile. "Of course, I'll behave for now." She left the greenhouse with her borrowed confidence intact, but her mind buzzing. Imported bulbs, enriched fertilizer, scratched labels. Nothing suggested immediate harm, yet the mystery deepened. If the flowers themselves weren't the weapon, then the danger must lie elsewhere. Something or someone had orchestrated this display with intent, and Agatha was determined to find out. Agatha was sipping a lukewarm pint of bitter in the snug corner of the Fox and Hound, her notebook open and her mind buzzing with daffodils, disturbed soil, and scratched labels, when the pub door swung open with the clatter of boots and the faint smell of wet leather. James Lacey stood there, looking every bit the infuriatingly competent ex-detective, with hair slightly mussed and a frown that suggested both concern and moral superiority. "Agatha," he said, advancing through the low chatter of locals, "what on earth are you doing poking around Darcy Somerville's greenhouse? You really shouldn't. This is serious." His tone carried the combination of warning and mild exasperation that made her cheeks warm despite herself. "I could ask the same about you, Lacey," she replied, smiling faintly. "Are you here to supervise my gardening efforts or to admonish me for curiosity?" James leaned against the polished bar, arms folded. "Both. You don't know what you're walking into. There's more at stake than competition roses and daffodils. Clive Morton's death isn't a puzzle you can solve over a scone and a notebook." Agatha bristled, feigning irritation while secretly enjoying the attention. "I see. So your professional concern is equal parts moral panic and protective instinct?" She tilted her head, forcing him to meet her gaze. "How very noble." He gave her a sharp look. "You know very well this isn't about nobility. It's about not dying in a daffodil bed while trying to play amateur sleuth." Agatha stirred her beer slowly, considering her next words. "Dying seems a trifle dramatic, don't you think? I prefer living dangerously in small, socially acceptable doses. Besides, someone has to find out who is actually behind this, and judging by the state of Darcy's greenhouse, it isn't the flowers themselves." James's eyes flicked to her notebook. "What have you found?" She shrugged lightly, feigning modesty, while carefully noting the exact shade of his hesitation. Enriched fertilizer, imported bulbs, scratched-off labels, and someone is hiding something. That's enough for now. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Clive was upset recently. He had an argument with the festival committee about sponsorship, apparently, something he considered unethical. He was worried about who was funding the event and what influence they might have over the judging. Agatha's mind immediately whirred. Sponsorship? Influence? Possibly motive. She jotted a quick note in her notebook, eyes gleaming. So the competition isn't just about who grows the straightest daffodil. Someone's interests are financially entangled. James frowned, clearly unconvinced of her charm-based investigative methods. That's exactly why I'm warning you off. People with money and pride do not appreciate amateur detectives poking around their affairs. Agatha leaned back, allowing a faint smirk. I'll consider your warning, momentarily. She let her gaze linger a fraction too long, stirring a blush she refused to admit to herself. But I think I'll follow the money anyway. It might be more enlightening than my tea and scones. James shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and reluctant amusement tugging at his expression. You are really impossible. And you enjoy telling me so, she countered, softly, noting the faint tension in his jaw. He huffed, turning away slightly, but she caught the small smile he couldn't suppress. As he left, Agatha watched the pub door swing close behind him, feeling the curious mix of irritation, amusement, and that indefinable spark that always seemed to ignite whenever James Lacey appeared. She returned her attention to her notebook, letting the warmth of the pub, the rich scent of beer, and the faint whiff of wood smoke settle over her. The festival's finances, she decided, held the next clue. Money, influence, and jealousy, a combination Carsely would never suspect. Agatha Raisin naturally intended to uncover all three.
Chapter 5. Red Herrings in Bloom. Agatha arrived at the village hall with a sense of grim satisfaction, though she was careful to disguise it under a polite smile. The hall smelled faintly of wax polish, damp coats, and the lingering aroma of lemon drizzle from a previous meeting. The news she had just uncovered about Clive Morton's argument over banned chemicals felt momentarily thrilling, yet oddly unsatisfying. Apparently, Clive had recently threatened to expose a local floristry supplier, Mr. Haversham, for using a particular additive in his fertilizers. According to Clive, the chemicals were perfectly harmless to flowers, but posed risks to anyone with severe allergies, an accusation that had sent the supplier into a panicked spiral. Agatha raised an eyebrow. The idea that a man's obsession with daffodils could result in life-threatening consequences for humans struck her as, well, very Clive. She had overheard snippets at the police station earlier. Mr. Haversham had been detained briefly for questioning, his hands trembling slightly, apron smeared, and hair sticking up in ways that suggested genuine fear rather than guilty plotting. It's just a misunderstanding, he insisted repeatedly, glancing nervously at Darcy's perfect blooms through the barred station windows. Agatha, sipping a strong cup of tea while listening politely, noted that the man's panic seemed rooted more in potential embarrassment than criminal intent. The police had released him with a warning, satisfied, on paper, that the chemicals were not a direct threat, and that Clive's concern, while well-founded, did not amount to murder. Yet something nagged at Agatha. Her gut, finely tuned by years of minor social disasters and full-scale investigations, whispered that the story didn't sit quite right. The timing of the chemical's use, the missing notebook, Darcy's obsessive greenhouse guard, Haversham's panicked behavior, Clive's missing records, and the odd scratches on fertilizer labels. Each detail alone was interesting, but together they formed a patchwork that refused to resolve into clarity. A red herring, perhaps, or the first deliberate distraction in a carefully orchestrated series of events. Agatha leaned back, eyes tracing the sway of the daffodils outside. They were innocent-looking, yet somehow complicit in their perfection. She would wait, she would watch, and she would notice everything. This was Carsely. Things unfolded slowly, and the true story never revealed itself in a single convenient package.
Her gut told her the case was deeper than petty rivalry, banned chemicals, or a single panicked supplier. And naturally, Agatha Raisin would be ready when it did. With a final sip of tea, she settled into her chair, Boswell sprawled across her notes, Hodge smugly supervising, and began the delicate task of waiting and watching.
By mid-afternoon, the village hall had transformed from cheerful festival prep to a room brimming with tension. Villagers whispered behind cupped hands, eyes darting like birds among the chairs and tables. Agatha Raisin perched on the edge of a stiff wooden bench, notebook open, tea cooling at her elbow, ready to observe and catalog the latest twist. Mrs. Turner, a woman whose glare could prune a rose from 5 feet away, had burst into the hall in dramatic fashion. I must confess," she stammered, wringing her gloves like damp laundry. "It was me. I moved some of the bulbs. I didn't mean, I thought Clive was being unfair, so I only wanted to, level the playing field." Gasps rippled through the room. Agatha raised a single eyebrow, notebook poised. The confession was theatrically vague, yet full of self-inflicted guilt. "Level the playing field," Mrs. Turner repeated, voice cracking as she sank into a chair. "I didn't know it would... it wasn't meant to hurt him, honest." Agatha leaned forward, peering over her glasses. Something didn't fit. The timeline, the details of the bulb adjustments, and the locations Mrs. Turner described clashed with what she had observed in the greenhouse and at the village green. She scribbled notes: soil disturbance, missing notebook, unusual fertilizer, and then the minor but telling detail. Clive had fallen at a particular spot, beside the waxy patch of daffodils. Mrs. Turner's actions, while mischievous and reckless, could not have produced that specific outcome. "Let me get this straight," Agatha said, her voice calm but cutting like pruning shears. "You adjusted bulbs, perhaps shifted soil, but you did not intend him to collapse, not to be harmed beyond a little floral embarrassment." "Yes, it was only supposed to make him look foolish, perhaps question the symmetry of Darcy's blooms or mine. I never meant anyone to get hurt. It was foolish, and I panicked, but I didn't—" I faltered, the confession crumpling under its own theatrical weight. Agatha's notebook filled with small, precise annotations, motive without intent, method without malice, a miscalculation somewhere along the chain of events. Someone had tampered with the flowers, yes, but the fatality had not been planned. The question now was who had miscalculated so catastrophically, and why Clive had been in precisely the wrong place at the wrong time. Darcy's greenhouse flashed in her mind, the immaculate flowers, the exotic bulbs, the enriched fertilizer, Haversham's panicked expressions, the missing notebook. Each clue seemed to spin around a central axis of incompetence and human pride, yet beneath it lay a sharper, more deliberate pattern, one that Mrs. Turner had only grazed. Agatha sipped her cooling tea, noting the faint aroma of lemon and paper mingling in the air. Humor bubbled faintly despite the gravity. Mrs. Turner's performance was dramatic enough to make a silent observer, like Boswell at home, roll their eyes in judgment. Yet Agatha suppressed a smile. The village may have overreacted, but she was already mapping the divergence between intention and consequence, the subtle ways human error had intersected with darker motives. By the time the hall began to empty, with Mrs. Turner escorted gently to sit outside and regain composure, Agatha had drawn mental lines between what had happened, what was intended, and what remained obscured. The confession had clarified nothing about the actual death, only that some village mischief had escalated unpredictably. Agatha closed her notebook and stood, adjusting her scarf. Her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the daffodils swaying innocently in the spring breeze. The flowers themselves had become a silent puzzle, almost mocking in their perfection. She would need to revisit them, examine them carefully, and consider each petal, each label, each trace of fertilizer in the soil, because someone in Carsely had miscalculated, someone else had ensured Clive's fall,
and Agatha Raisin, naturally, intended to discover exactly who and why.
Chapter 6. The Soil Tells Stories. The morning air carried a crisp, earthy scent as Agatha returned to the village green, notebook tucked under one arm and her sensible shoes sinking slightly into damp grass. The daffodils, swaying gently, seemed almost smug in their morning freshness, unaware of the detective inspection about to unfold. She crouched beside a cluster of blooms, inhaling the delicate perfume and noting the soil's subtle texture. Nature, she thought wryly, had its own mischief to contribute. Her breakthrough arrived courtesy of Dr. Margaret Pritchard, an eccentric botanist visiting the village for the festival. Margaret's hair was wind-tousled, and her spectacles sat crookedly on her nose as she crouched beside Agatha, peering at the yellow heads with an intensity that suggested she would rather be examining a rare orchid in a greenhouse than engaging in small talk. "Notice anything unusual?" Margaret asked, voice sharp yet amused. Agatha gestured toward the glossy petals. Waxy petals, unusually vigorous growth, but nothing lethal on touch, no soil residue, at least not to the ordinary observer. Margaret nodded. "Precisely. But you see, some daffodil varieties have a curious property. They can absorb toxins through their roots and deposit trace amounts in their nectar. Most people wouldn't touch it twice, but if it reaches food or drink, ingestion becomes a concern." Agatha's pen hovered. "You mean someone drank it?" Margaret adjusted her glasses. "Tea, perhaps, sweetened with honey. If there were beehives nearby, pollinators could transfer minuscule amounts of toxin from the daffodils to the honey. A harmless-looking cup could carry enough to cause illness or, in rare cases, collapse." Her mind clicked. Clive had sipped festival tea, carefully sweetened with honey from hives stationed suspiciously close to the daffodil display. The waxy blooms were not poisonous themselves. They had acted as conduits, ferrying the toxin through an unsuspecting medium. Agatha leaned back slightly, absorbing the elegance of the solution. Nature's cooperation, combined with human negligence, or intent, was a surprisingly cozy form of murder. She scribbled furiously. Flowers, not weapon. Nectar carrier. Poison transferred, not inherent. "Who moved the hives?" Agatha asked, curiosity sharpening her tone. "Someone must have positioned them deliberately." Margaret tapped the edge of her notebook. "Precisely, and only a person with knowledge of these absorption properties could orchestrate it. Not every gardener or committee member would realize that daffodils could ferry toxins in this way." Her brow furrowed. Someone had planned with botanical precision. She pictured Darcy's greenhouse, the exotic bulbs, the enriched fertilizer, and the carefully scratched-off labels. Even Haversham's panicked reaction now fit a pattern: knowledge, fear, access. The village buzzed faintly in the background, the clinking of cups, distant laughter, and the occasional bird song. Agatha imagined the killer moving hives, considering which blooms could carry a payload unseen. Her mind raced, yet she moved slowly, deliberately, enjoying the interplay of deduction and domestic calm. She crouched again, fingers brushing damp soil, inhaling the faint sweetness of pollen, and realized that the answer lay not in visible danger, but in subtle manipulation. The poison had traveled, almost innocently, through nectar via nature's own agents. Clever, almost too clever. Agatha stood, notebook brimming, and let the warmth of spring seep into her shoulders. The killer was narrowing, someone with botanical knowledge, festival access, and patience to orchestrate the perfect chain of events. Hodge would have approved of the cunning, she thought. Boswell, undoubtedly, would have been unimpressed with the slow pace. Either way, the next steps were clear: observe, deduce, and prepare for confrontation. Nature had whispered its secret. Agatha would follow it to its human source. The daffodils swayed lightly in the breeze, their yellow heads tilting as if to nudge her forward. Someone had planned Clive's collapse with meticulous care, and Agatha Raisin was determined to see the strings behind the petals. Agatha returned to her cottage that evening, the glow of sunset spilling across the Cotswold rooftops, and poured herself a cup of Earl Grey. steam curling lazily in the warm kitchen light. Hodge and Boswell regarded her with their usual judgment. Boswell perched atop her scattered notes, tail flicking in disdain, and Hodge on the windowsill, looking smugly omniscient. Agatha muttered to herself, stirring sugar absent-mindedly, and replayed the day's observations. Something had clicked. Clive's collapse, the subtle manipulation of flowers, the poisoned honey. It was elegant, precise, and deliberate. Yet one pattern eluded the casual observers: the role of the overlooked, the quiet, the politely invisible. Agatha's mind drifted to Mr. Callahan, the mild-mannered festival coordinator who had been standing politely in the background throughout the chaos. His voice rarely rose above a whisper, his presence unobtrusive, and yet he had been everywhere, near the displays, the hives, even within whispering distance of Clive before the fatal collapse. She recalled subtle remarks he had made during committee meetings. "Perhaps we should check the soil again," he had suggested quietly, almost apologetically, when others had waved off her concerns, just to ensure uniformity. Agatha now realized that his words had been dismissed as pedantry or nervous fussiness, yet in retrospect there had been precision and knowledge behind each carefully chosen phrase. Agatha jotted notes, the pen scratching softly against paper. Mr. Callahan had both motive and opportunity, overlooked, underappreciated, and quietly resentful of the festival's glittering personalities. He had access to both the displays and the honey hives. His mild manner masked an intelligence that could orchestrate the complex sequence required to poison Clive without overtly touching a dangerous chemical. She recalled, too, how he had reacted to Clive's previous criticisms of sponsorship and competition fairness. There had been a flicker of irritation in his eyes, a faint tightening of the jaw when others debated prize regulations. Not overt anger, not passion, just the subtle resentment of someone who had spent years behind the scenes, unnoticed, yet fully aware of every detail. Agatha sipped her tea, letting the aroma of bergamot and chamomile settle her thoughts. The picture formed slowly, elegantly, like petals unfolding. The quiet one, underestimated, observant, meticulous. Someone who understood both horticulture and human behavior had likely orchestrated the misdirection. The scratched labels, the enriched fertilizer, the misplaced hives, all aligned with a mind comfortable hiding in plain sight. She stood, moving to the window to watch the last slanting rays fall on the daffodils. The flowers swayed gently in the evening breeze, their yellow faces glowing in the soft light, seemingly innocent yet complicit in the story. The scene felt almost cozy, but beneath it lay cunning calculation. Agatha smiled faintly at the satisfaction of connecting dots long ignored. Hodge yawned loudly, as if to say, "Finally, something interesting." Boswell pawed at her notebook, demanding attention. Agatha chuckled, placing a hand on each cat in turn. The domestic calm grounded her, reminded her that even intricate murder plots could unfold against the backdrop of tea, cats, and gentle village life. Her resolve hardened. The evidence had pointed quietly, subtly, toward a single individual, the quiet one. Public confrontation would soon be necessary, and Agatha's mind ticked through the steps: timing, audience, exposure. She would need tact, courage, and her usual stubborn flair. As the Cotswold evening deepened and the scent of primroses drifted through the open window, Agatha Raisin felt the thrill of near completion. The daffodils had whispered their secret, the honey had sung its hidden warning, and the quiet one, once invisible, was about to step into the light, unwittingly, precisely where Agatha intended to find them.
Chapter 7. A Public Blooming. Festival day arrived with the usual pageantry. Bunting flapped cheerfully in the spring breeze, scent of fresh scones mingled with damp grass, and daffodils swayed proudly in their competition beds. Agatha, notebook clutched tightly under one arm, wove through the crowds with a purposeful gait, drawing curious glances from villagers who were blissfully unaware that the day's glamour masked a sinister past. Hodge and Boswell would have been scandalized by the lack of feline oversight, Agatha thought wryly. She ignored the tittering children and the overly enthusiastic brass band, focusing on the subtle cues she had memorized: the nervous hands of Mr. Callahan, the meticulous but slightly crooked tags on the daffodil beds, and the faint tang of enriched fertilizer still lingering near the exotic blooms. She found him, Mr. Callahan, standing near the center of the green, polishing a brass plaque with almost obsessive care. Agatha approached, adopting her most charmingly authoritative expression. "Mr. Callahan," she began, voice carrying above the gentle murmur of the crowd, "I do believe we have some unresolved matters concerning Clive Morton's unfortunate collapse." A hush fell. Villagers paused mid-step, cups of tea suspended, as eyes turned toward the unfolding drama. Agatha smiled faintly, knowing that spectacle and subtlety combined to her advantage. "The evidence," she continued, flipping open her notebook dramatically, "points to careful orchestration. Disturbed soil, hives positioned near the displays, enriched fertilizer, and, of course, daffodils capable of transferring toxins via nectar. The culprit intended no fatality, merely intimidation, a warning in edible form. Yet Clive, the diligent judge, found himself at precisely the wrong place at the wrong time." Mr. Callahan paled, hands gripping the plaque. I didn't mean exactly," Agatha interjected, voice light yet sharp. "You wanted to scare, not kill, but someone must take responsibility for the consequences of subtle botanical mischief, wouldn't you agree?" The crowd murmured, some faces stricken, some amused. Darcy Somerville clutched her gloves, as if the drama were a particularly juicy bloom she couldn't touch. Mrs. Turner wiped a tear of relief, or perhaps theatrical effect, while Agatha noted a ripple of satisfaction in her notebook, revelation and humor in equal measure. "You threatened exposure, Mr. Callahan," Agatha continued, "should Clive report illegal practices, or, in your case, insufficiently ethical hives and fertilization. You used flowers and honey to deliver your point. Clever, meticulous, and ultimately revealed by observation and deduction. Quite the horticultural puzzle, wouldn't you agree?" The crowd leaned closer, a gentle chorus of disbelief, amusement, and appreciation. Villagers had never seen accusation delivered with such dry wit. Agatha's voice softened, adding warmth and charm. "Fortunately, no one was truly harmed, though one might argue about the psychological stress inflicted on a certain floristry supplier." A ripple of laughter followed, soft and cozy, easing tension without diminishing accountability. Mr. Callahan swallowed, nodding slowly. "Yes," he admitted, voice faint. "I only intended to scare him. I didn't realize he would collapse. It was a miscalculation." Agatha closed her notebook, allowing the moment to settle. The flowers seemed to nod approvingly, their petals golden and triumphant. The festival air, once thick with tension, now held a sense of gentle restoration, and even the clinking of teacups seemed celebratory. Police officers, present but relaxed, had listened carefully. Agatha had laid out facts, motives, and consequences clearly. Their nods suggested acceptance without immediate intervention. Carsely's authorities had learned to trust Agatha's instincts. As she stepped back, letting the crowd absorb the truth, Agatha felt the familiar mix of triumph and amusement. Justice had been served, social decorum preserved, and the underlying chaos of village rivalry transformed into an entertaining anecdote. Hodge would have approved of the precision, Boswell of the dramatic flourish. Agatha allowed herself a small, private smile, letting the warmth of accomplishment and spring sunlight settle around her. The daffodils, proud and untroubled, seemed to bask in their part in the story. Carsely's festival had reached its climax, both public and personal. Agatha Raisin, ever vigilant and delightfully self-important, had untangled the threads of intrigue, leaving the village restored, curious, and thoroughly entertained.
The village green shimmered with spring sunlight as the police, discreet but decisive, stepped forward to place Mr. Callahan under arrest. He raised no objection, face pale, hands raised politely as though handing over a particularly delicate bouquet rather than surrendering to the law. The onlookers murmured softly, a blend of shock, relief, and amusement. The daffodils seemed to sway knowingly, their golden heads tilting as if nodding in agreement. Darcy Somerville, standing near her prized display, looked momentarily undone. Her hands fluttered over her gloves, as though trying to regain composure after a particularly vicious wind had tousled her hair. Her perfectly manicured display, once the envy of the village, now seemed slightly diminished, the sheen of dominance tarnished by the exposure of true villainy. Agatha, sipping tea from a flask she had smuggled into the festival, allowed herself a small smirk. Not victory exactly, but satisfaction, the sort that came from unraveling secrets no one else could see. The officers led Mr. Callahan gently away, explaining quietly that the arrest was precautionary rather than punitive. The intent had been to scare, not kill, yet consequences must follow. Villagers whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of fascination and horror, softened by springtime serenity. Agatha observed each interaction with the careful scrutiny of someone cataloging both human behavior and village gossip. A child tugged at his mother's skirt, pointing at the golden daffodils. Money, did the flowers make him do it? The woman laughed nervously, and Agatha felt the warmth of absurdity wrap around her like a soft shawl. Yes, the flowers had been instrumental, though unwittingly, yet the danger had been human cunning disguised under the guise of gentle horticulture. Darcy, finally regaining some composure, adjusted her hat with a faint huff. Agatha approached, notebook in hand, ready for the obligatory exchange of barbed civility. "Quite a day," I said lightly, keeping tone measured. "I trust your blooms are unharmed by the drama." Darcy's lips pressed into a thin line. "They are, Mrs. Raisin, but one's sense of certainty, rather less so." The edge of humility, or perhaps the faintest acknowledgment of fallibility, tinged her words. Agatha nodded with quiet satisfaction. Darcy's moment of perfection had passed, though she would doubtless reclaim her crown in time. Pride was resilient in Carsely. Meanwhile, Agatha reflected on her own position. She had won no trophies, no applause, no first-place ribbons. Yet she had untangled the web of deceit, uncovered the true instigator, and preserved the safety of her fellow villagers. Her cats, Hodge and Boswell, would have regarded this as a job well done. Judgment meted out with elegance, logic applied with flair, and human folly exposed for its absurdity. Returning to her cottage later, Agatha carried a sense of gentle accomplishment. The village streets smelled faintly of spring rain and baking bread. The daffodils swayed in their beds as though celebrating without ceremony, and the quiet hum of domestic life restored a comforting rhythm. She poured tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands, and watched Hodge circle twice before settling on the armchair, while Boswell leapt onto her desk to inspect the notebook. Agatha allowed herself a small wry smile. Justice had been delivered without grimness, chaos had been transformed into order, and she had navigated the delicate dance of suspicion, humor, and human weakness. Carsley's festival would continue, though subtly altered by recent revelations, and she, ever curious, ever cautious, would remain vigilant. As she stirred her tea, listening to the soft clink of china and the occasional distant laugh from the village, Agatha Raisin felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She had uncovered the truth, restored balance among the flowers, and preserved the comforting, cozy essence of village life. No crown, no accolades, but everything that mattered.
Chapter 8. Tea, Cats, and Closure. Agatha unlocked her cottage door, the familiar creak greeting her like an old friend, the scent of fresh linen and the faint tang of lavender from her small herb garden wrapped around her, softening the tension of the past week. Hodge and Boswell, lounging in their usual spots, immediately regarded her with that measured combination of disapproval and curiosity that only cats could perfect. "Did you miss me?" Agatha asked lightly, though she knew the answer. Hodge blinked once, Boswell flicked his tail, and both returned to their silent judgment, their own peculiar brand of forgiveness evident in their willingness to allow her back into the living space unmolested. She busied herself in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with deliberate care. The aroma of strong coffee filled the room, joined by the gentle sizzle of buttered toast.
Hodge padded to the counter, sniffing with the faintest twitch of indignation, while Boswell perched on the windowsill, peering out as if evaluating whether the village had recovered from its recent upheavals. Agatha served their morning meal, watching carefully as the cats ate with ritualistic precision. Their approval, indicated by the slightest purr or tilt of the head, reassured her. Domestic life, mundane, cozy, and predictably ordered, grounded her. A balm after days of intrigue, jealousy, and botanical mischief. She settled into her favorite armchair, notebook open but untouched for the moment. The daffodils she had inspected, the honeyed poison, the carefully orchestrated scare, all now lay resolved behind a veil of ordinary village bustle. Carsley's festival continued, subtly altered, yet the air retained its gentle hum of spring. The streets smelled faintly of baked goods, cut grass, and a trace of wood smoke from chimneys, reminding Agatha that life, in its comforting, domestic way, persisted. Her gaze drifted to the notebook. She smiled faintly, reflecting on the sequence of events. Clive's collapse, Mrs. Turner's panicked confession, Darcy's protective pride, and the quiet cunning of Mr. Callahan. Each thread had woven together into a tapestry both intricate and oddly charming in its absurdity. She had observed, deduced, and orchestrated truth without ever raising a hand in force. Her weapon, as always, was curiosity, patience, and a touch of tenacity. Hodge leapt onto the arm of the chair, resting his head in her lap. Boswell followed suit, settling across the notebook in an unmistakable claim of ownership. Agatha chuckled, scratching behind Hodge's ears. "You lot forgive easily, don't you?" She sipped her coffee, feeling warmth radiate through her chest, and allowed herself the rare luxury of fatigue mingled with pride. As the morning light spilled through the windows, illuminating the tidy chaos of her home, Agatha considered the next steps. Carsely was quiet now, but trouble had a way of creeping in when least expected, whether in the guise of jealous neighbors, competitive florists, or mysterious visitors bearing obscure horticultural knowledge. She made a mental note to keep her eyes open, though for now the cat's contented presence and the comfort of her familiar surroundings sufficed. The kettle sang its gentle whistle, punctuating the silence with a cozy domestic rhythm. Agatha refilled her cup and glanced at the window one last time. Beyond the garden gate, the village stirred. Children ran, neighbors chatted, and the daffodils swayed innocently in the spring breeze. Everything had returned to its peaceful cadence, yet the faint tug of curiosity lingered, promising that Carsely and Agatha herself would never truly know a dull moment. With Hodge purring and Boswell settled, Agatha Raisin allowed herself a small private smile. Victorious, exhausted, and quietly satisfied, she leaned back, the soft light warming her shoulders, and wondered what new trouble might spring up next.
The late afternoon sunlight slanted through Agatha's cottage windows, painting the room in soft gold. Hodge and Boswell were curled in their favorite spots, Hodge on the windowsill, Boswell on a pile of notebooks, and seemed unusually content after the morning's domestic restoration. Agatha poured herself a final cup of tea, inhaling the comforting aroma of Earl Grey and the faint hint of lavender from the small bouquet she had arranged on the windowsill. The village seemed to sigh in collective relief, the daffodils outside bobbing gently in the spring breeze. The doorbell chimed, and Agatha rose, adjusting her scarf and smoothing her hair in a fleeting, self-critical gesture that Hodge observed with faint amusement. She opened the door to find a woman standing there, mid-30s, with an air of crisp competence and a smile that suggested both charm and challenge. She carried a small potted rose bush, its buds delicate and promising. "Hello," the woman said brightly. "I'm Marjorie Whitlock. I've just moved into the cottage at the end of the lane. Thought I'd introduce myself and bring a little color. I hope roses are welcome in Carsely." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly, though a subtle, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. "Roses, you say?" she murmured, stepping aside to allow the visitor in. "Always welcome, though one must be careful with newcomers, especially ones bearing gifts." Marjorie's smile widened, oblivious to the slight undercurrent in Agatha's tone. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of causing trouble," she said.
I just enjoy flowers, gardens, a bit of healthy competition perhaps, nothing too dramatic. Yet, she gave a small laugh, placing the rosebush on the kitchen table. The faint fragrance of budding petals mingled with tea and cat fur, creating a cozy, intoxicating blend of scents. Agatha watched her carefully, letting the visitor's casual charm mingle with the tension of potential rivalry. Her mind catalogued Marjorie's poise, the careful choice of rose variety, and the slightly defiant tilt of her chin. Already, Agatha sensed that a new thread of competition was being woven into Carsely's familiar tapestry. Her previous victories, though sweet, had prepared her for this precise moment, the entrance of a rival whose skills were subtle, promising, and perhaps a little dangerous. Hodge blinked once, Boswell flicked his tail with mild curiosity, and Agatha Raisin, victorious yet ever vigilant, let her gaze linger on the new bloom. A smile played at her lips, a dangerous, knowing smile. She was ready. The garden, after all, had never been quiet for long.